My name's Giles Tillotson. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to DAG. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I just want to say one or two sentences about the exhibition that you're sitting in, which is not directly related to the topic, but tangentially so. It's called Destination India, Foreign Artists in India, 1857 to 1947. The point of the exhibition is that it's the first exhibition that looks at artists from abroad, traveling and working in India in this later period. There have been any number of exhibitions on the pioneers, indeed including at DAG, on artists like William Hodges and Thomas Daniel and Balthasar Solvins, who all pitched up here at the end of the 18th century, which is in fact the period we're going to be talking about shortly. But this is the first exhibition to look at the period when you might think that visual representation of India was dominated by the camera. And indeed that's what I had always assumed until I learnt of the existence of artists like Hugo Pedersen and Marius Bauer, and then realized that they had quite a lot in common and were worth putting together. It's also the first exhibition globally that looks at the Indian aspect of Orientalist art. There's so much, again, that's been dedicated to the European representation of the Middle East, of the Islamic civilizations of North Africa, and usually India gets left out of that story. So we think we're plugging two gaps. Having plugged my exhibition, but also to say, of course, it's an indicative of the recent expansion of DAG's own interests. I mean, we've been known for a very long time as India's leading gallery, collecting, displaying, interpreting 20th century Indian art. But as you may have noticed, we've expanded our interests historically backwards to include the 19th and 18th centuries. This is one of those landmark exhibitions. Do please have a look at it before you leave when this meeting breaks up. And if after seeing it you have had a surfeit of nostalgic images of the 19th century, then wander upstairs where we have a selection of 20th century art from the DAG collection, so you can remind yourself of the gritty realities of the century that we were all born in. Turning, though, to our guest speaker, I don't think that Ira Mukhoty needs much introduction from me, since you've obviously turned out in such numbers to listen to her. But a word or two to set the scene. Ira actually started out life as a scientist. She read natural sciences at Cambridge, but turned to the writing of history, the researching and writing of history, if I remember correctly, primarily for the benefit of your daughters. She felt that her daughters did not have adequate female Indian role models, or at least they existed, but they weren't written about. And so she wrote a book called Heroines, Powerful Women of Indian History. And then that led her into the Mughal world. She subsequently wrote Daughters of the Sun, about the leading ladies of the Mughal Empire, and a 600-page biography of the Emperor Akbar. But in her latest book, like one of the poets who's mentioned in it, Mir Taqi Mir, she has now forsaken the admittedly slightly faded but elegant and antique lanes of Delhi for the shimmering lights of Lucknow. And so I long to find out what it was that lured her away from the courtly elegance of Delhi to, let's say, the different qualities of Lucknow. She's going to focus particularly on the vision of the two most important Nawabs of the 18th century, Shuja Daula and his son Asaf Daula. These are figures who, as she rightly points out, had got a very, very bad press from the British. I mean, it was partly a lot at the time and subsequently, which was part of a kind of sustained campaign to undermine the Nawabs of Lucknow as a way of justifying the annexation of the state. We did an exhibition a couple of years ago on Tipu Sultan, and we were exploring there a similar kind of campaign of ruining a perfectly capable ruler's reputation in order to just justify colonial expansion. And so Ira's campaign, I think, is to reinstate these two elegant Nawabs. Over to you. Yeah, she's going to talk to some slides for about half an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll give you an opportunity to join in.
Thank you so much, Giles, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for all the Delhiites who have shown up here today in such numbers. I'm absolutely overwhelmed. When I saw the weather, the rain, the return of the Kamariyas, I thought this is a ridiculous business to have people come all the way into town like this. But thank you so much for showing up. I'm particularly grateful to DAG for inviting me here this evening because for those of you who know my work a little bit, who often ask me questions about sources, and for me, the visual images, paintings, and other such materials have been really important as, in my work as a writer of narrative history in trying to recreate these lost worlds. So being in the space of images, of paintings, is particularly apt. In fact, this book, The Lion and the Lily, I had to explore a wide range of museums, far more than I had done before ever in any of my books. And it's a reflection of the 18th century that I'm talking about in this book. The 18th century was a place of great turbulence, but also of great creativity, especially from the Indian rulers, the new Indian rulers who were coming up. And it is something that has been forgotten, that is not often brought to the fore. So as I take you through this presentation, I hope you will appreciate some of the spaces in which our great works of painting, of art, now lie in all sorts of different museums around the world, and how difficult it is sometimes to form a coherent idea of what the 18th century was. So as Giles was saying, my heroes, such as they are these two gentlemen, Nawab Asaf Daula on the left and his father Shuja Daula on the right, painted here by one of the first European oil painters to come to Awadh, Tillotson. Now, very briefly, these gentlemen began their journey in India in the early 18th century. Shuja Daula's grandfather was a Persian immigrant to the Mughal court. As neighboring Safavid Persia crumbled, many of the elite Persian men started drifting into Mughal India, looking for better prospects. And so the first Nawab, Saadat Ali Khan, he was given the Suba of Agra, which was extremely prestigious and also a very rich area. But in the course of his work with the Mughal emperor, he failed to quell a Jat rebellion sufficiently well. And so as a punishment, he was sent to the Suba of Awadh. So Awadh really began as a punishment posting, the Badlands of Awadh. Even though it was this huge area between Bengal on the right and Mughal Delhi on the left, it was considered a sort of buffer zone, a bad land between these two areas. But the Nawabs would go on to create something really extraordinary, which is what I want to talk about. The very first so this is an interpretation of the earlier image. So those images that we just saw of both these Nawabs by Tillotson really influenced the way Indians would view the painting of elite figures. Until then, Mughal art treated them in the typical miniature manner of the side profile, of very coyly hinting at who the person was, but you didn't show it very clearly. Rather, you put in a lot of objects which signified their royal status. You might put a halo, or you might put people with fly whisks, or you might put a parasol. But you didn't show the figure as clearly as the Europeans did. So what I find amusing in this 1772 painting by an Indian artist is that the painter hasn't quite dared show Shuja Daula as barely as the European did. So he's added a little elephant in the background, which was always a symbol of royalty. And he's also got these two gentlemen next to him, his attendants with the fly whisk. So he hasn't, even though the expression, as you can see, is much more realistic compared to the earlier types of paintings, he has still added all these accoutrements around him of royalty. Okay. So I'm hoping that all you Delhiites will recognize this famous tomb, which is Safdarjung's tomb. Now, Shuja Daula's father was Safdarjung, and he was a Delhi courtier. He lived most of his life in Delhi, serving the Mughal emperor. But what happened after him was that Shuja Daula, who became Nawab next, became embroiled in the Battle of Buxar. So at the time of the Battle of Buxar, the EIC had taken over Bengal. The Battle of Plassey had already taken place, and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam decided to try and mount a counter-offensive, and Shuja Daula was part of this attempt, and of course, he was defeated. So what happened for the Nawabs of Awadh after Buxar was that they were determined to distance themselves away from the politics of Delhi and concentrate on Awadh, on making Awadh a great cultural center. But Safdarjung's tomb was built in this style in Delhi itself because he was one of the great courtiers of Delhi. And what happened to Safdarjung's tomb is that it very quickly became compared unfavorably to tombs like the nearby Humayun's tomb. Even Zafar Hasan in the early 20th century, when he was making a compendium of all Delhi monuments, he said Safdarjung's tomb is like a last flicker in the lamp of Mughal architecture. And before him, an English bishop traveling through Delhi had said, oh, it has some fine inlaid marbles, but it has too much the color of potted meat to please me. So he found it too red, presumably. So many such insidious remarks were made about Safdarjung's tomb, and somehow it was deemed to be a lesser tomb. But if you look at it closely, it's actually an extremely interesting tomb, and rather than being the last flicker of a typically Mughal-style architecture, it is really the first of the great Nawabi architecture that would then, rise up in such efflorescence in Lucknow and Faizabad. Now, a lot of the things about Safdarjung do have Mughal imperial elements. It is a monumental tomb. It is on a plinth, so it's raised like Humayun's tomb. It has a combination of red sandstone and white marble inlaid. It is set inside a huge chaharbagh. It has enclosing walls. It has 4 baradris. It has a mosque. So it is an enormous structure. It is an imposing structure. It is also the first monumental tomb which was not built for a Mughal emperor or his wives or his family. This was simply a courtier, and yet it was built in this style. But there are 2 other things which are really interesting about this monument. The first is in the style of decorations that it has. Now, most Mughal all the Mughal architecture that you can think of say the high Shah Jahani style, whether it's the Taj Mahal, and if you can recollect it in your mind, you will see an image of white marble with inlay work in it, which is very typical of Shah Jahani high art, and which was considered the pinnacle of aestheticism, the pinnacle of fine art. But instead, what we have in Safdarjung's tomb, inside it and also on the outside in places, is this sort of 3D sculptural decoration, which is much more alive in a sense. It has huge vegetal forms, it has huge flowers, it has twirling vines, all of this made out of stucco. Not stone, not marble or sandstone, but stucco, which is made from limestone wafers mixed in with water and crushed eggshells, and made into a smooth paste which is very malleable, almost like plastic. So it's easy to form all these wonderful structures. And you can see on the inside, they're almost coming out at you in this sort of manner, which is really truly unique and the beginning of a new type of style, which we would see much more, in a much more confident manner in Lucknow and Faizabad. Even the cenotaph at the bottom, Safdarjung's cenotaph, those of you who have seen Shah Jahan's cenotaph, you can imagine the white marble with the colored, beautiful gemstone carved in inlay work, flat against the surface, very different from this almost, alive sort of manner in which the acanthus leaves are kind of made out of marble in this particular case. So that's the first thing of importance to note. The second really interesting point when I was thinking about what the Nawabs were trying to do, I made this rather amateur sort of map to show you that where Safdarjung's tomb is built is in the middle of a zone of architecture which has huge resonance for the Shia Muslims. There are a number of structures which are extremely important. It's the area called Aliganj today, around Jorbagh, for those of you who are familiar. Today it has lost its integrity, so we don't realize it, but it was a huge area owned by the Nawabs of Awadh, and it contained Shahi Mardan Dargah, which was a very important site for Shia Muslims. It also had Qadam Rasul, the footprint of Imam Ali, supposedly, on a piece of stone, and a number of structures built by Qudsiya Begum. So this whole area of Aliganj was extremely important for the Shia Muslims, and Safdarjung's tomb is built right next to it, as is Najaf Khan's tomb, also a very famous Shia Persian general. So what is interesting is that whereas it is often compared unfavorably to Humayun's tomb, which is just down the road on a very straight axis, actually what it is doing is mirroring the association of Humayun's tomb with Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. I mean, I'm sure many of you know that Nizamuddin Aulia was extremely important to the Mughals, and they often tried to be buried close to the charisma of this great Sufi saint. And all this mausoleum of the Mughals is built within a very small radius of Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. And all visiting Mughal emperors would always go and pay a visit to Humayun's tomb and to the Dargah. So in fact, by building Safdarjung's tomb in this zone of influence for the Shia Muslims, Shuja Daula was actually making a very powerful statement about what he was trying to achieve. He was, in a sense, distancing himself a little bit from the Sunni Mughals. He was paying homage, certainly, because he did use some of the same tropes, but he was also posing a challenge and saying, I am also going to be doing something different. Because at this very time, the urban politics of Delhi was changing completely. You had these elites who were coming up and were clearly posing a challenge to the integrity of Mughal Delhi and were beginning to set up court in so-called provincial areas, which were going to come up as powerfully, if not more so, of course, than crumbling Mughal Delhi at the time. So in fact, the image which resonates for me more strongly than the earlier ones is this one, because we see Safdarjung's tomb as it was meant to be at that time. It was a place of pilgrimage. Many visiting dignitaries, especially from Awadh, would come and pay homage here. It was a place where you could set up your tents. If you were traveling through, you could set up your food and have banquets, have entertainments. It was really a lived place and part of the Shia sort of pilgrimage that you would go through when you were walking through Delhi, as opposed to the ones that would take place visiting Humayun's tomb, for example, and Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah. So, what else do we have to sort of give us confidence in this sort of interpretation? Now, if we look at this extraordinary painting, it is from a Gentil album. So Shuja Daula, once he went to Faizabad, he collected a lot of French military men to help him in his campaign to strengthen his army. And one of them was this man called Jean-Baptiste Gentil. And he commissioned these extraordinary set of albums that he took back with him to France. And this lies today. I think this one is at the Victorian Album Museum. A lot of them are in Paris as well. But he depicts this commemoration of Muharram. So this particular commemoration takes place on the 10th day of Muharram, so the Shia Muslims, very briefly. In 680 CE, Imam Hussein was martyred at the Battle of Karbala. And so even to this day, Shia Muslims remember this tragedy of Karbala, and they spend these 10 days in prayer, in recollection, in self-flagellation, in mourning. And on the 10th day, they set off in a procession, carrying the tombs of the Imams made in these ephemeral materials. So this is something that was typically that had grown really typically out of the Indian subcontinent. Because if you can imagine an event which happened in 680 CE in a land far away in present-day Iraq, by the time it travels to India, the sort of changes that take place in it are really revolutionary. So many of these objects and things that become part of the commemoration of Muharram are actually very typical to the Indian scenario. And this setting off in a huge procession like this, carrying these tombs of the imams, was also something that Shuja Daula began doing in a really, in a very ostentatious manner. And we know this from this painting. So you can see the way in which the figures are very small at the top and larger towards us. It's showing movement. So it is implying that this procession is moving through the city, and all the people are joining in, carrying banners, carrying alams, carrying all the specific objects that denote Shia rituals. There's even a burak up there, which is a mythological creature with a woman's face and a horse's body. And there are all these tazia. So the tazia is a typically Indian element. In the Middle East, it is meant to symbolize a passion play, but in India, it became this tomb to symbolize the tomb of the imams that were going to be carried to a water body and immersed in the water, or else buried in a Karbala. So this is showing us those kind of processions taking place, and in the corresponding pages of Gentil's book, he has written a full description of what happens, and he says that Shuja Daula did this every year. He did it with great ostentation, and everybody took part in it. Now, if we remember that the Shia population at the time was really tiny, in fact, most of the countryside of Awadh was Hindu Rajputs. The Sunni population was about 10%, and of that, the Shia was really tiny. So the implications are already that a great deal of other people, apart from just the Shia Muslims, are taking part in commemorations of this sort, in creating some of the structures, in providing the water and the food for the people passing by, in the many, many rituals that take place around this time. Now, but the image that we just saw, even though it shows this long procession, there are no structures, there are no buildings. It's sort of floating in space as if it happened in a plane far away, without really being anchored in geographic space. But Shuja Daula's son, Asaf Daula, when he took over in 1775, he started a building program 10 years later, probably in 1786. And in this building program, he built this huge agglomeration of buildings within which the Shia commemoration would take place in a much, much grander way than even Shuja Daula had ever done. So if you see this really interesting painting, it's a half-finished image, or rather than half-finished, it shows the buildings before they were entirely complete. They are in the process of completion. Right at the end is the grand big imambara of Asaf Daula. Now, the imambara is also a typically Indian construction. It began around the 16th century in the Deccan. And then when Asaf built it, it was by far the largest imambara ever built in the world at the time. It was even the largest pre-industrial vaulted building to be constructed without pillars. It's a freestanding vaulted space, which is extraordinary even today. So he had the grand imambara at the end. He had these two monumental gateways. He has a Shahi mosque on the side. He has these huge courtyards, which we are told also housed a hospital. It housed offices and a caravanserai. So this was an enormous space witin which these commemorations would take place, but also within which daily life would happen. So this is a lived space, not an isolated religious structure to visit once a year. This was really part of the life that he was creating for Lucknowis, and it was very much in the middle of his building project. And in fact, if we look at this beautiful painting by Sitaram in this collection, in the DAG collection, so you remember I think I'll just, use this to show you, the big gateway which is closest to us. So before that is this structure, an additional gateway called the Rumi Darwaza on the east, and there was an equivalent Darwaza on the west. That one is no longer extant, but there were these two huge gateways with an enormous space in between, and lining the courtyard were shops, and the shops paid rental, and the rental was meant to help in the upkeep of the Imambara, pay for all the illuminations, pay for the Marcia Khwans, for all the elegies being sung. So this was a space entirely conceived to function independently and to commemorate in a very ostentatious manner this new Shia challenge almost that had come up in Awadh. Now, at the end, there is the Rumi Darwaza, which is a really extraordinary building. And following on what I was saying in the beginning, all these buildings are also covered in stucco decoration, including the Rumi Darwaza. Now, on the inside, the Rumi Darwaza has a Tripolia type, if you can see the Tripolia type gateway with the 3 gateways, and on its other facade is this entirely different, amazing, unbelievably creative gateway. That's me, not just to for self-aggrandizement, but to show you the scale of the Rumi Darwaza and to show you the size of the decorations. You know the point I was making early on about the vegetal forms, about the twirling vines. You can see all of that along the cusped archway, the multi-cusped archway. You can see the twirling acanthus vines, the leaves, and right on the top, an enormous 5-lobed petal. This flower you can see everywhere. If you look carefully, so many of the structures have this kind of vegetal form. On the side, you have the double acanthus leaf. Again, all of this is in stucco work. Today, it looks, it doesn't look as impressive. It should have been gleaming white, all of it. But it was certainly something entirely unusual and new for the time. So this is just to show you how ambitious and huge this program of building was. You have the great Imambara at one end. You have the Friday Mosque, the 3 gateways, and then the Rumi Darwaza and its opposite, which is now missing. But you also had, to the right, the Machi Bhavan. So that was the administrative center, the political center, but also the domestic space of the Nawab and his family. To the left was the Stepwell Palace, which still exists, which was used in the summer. So what this actually shows us is that this whole space was very much part of the life of the Nawab, his family, and his courtiers. It wasn't just a space he came to during Muharram. He came to it very regularly. He lived just nearby. It was very much part of his zone of influence and an area that all his courtiers, all his people would be visiting very often. Today, because so little remains of, say, the outer courtyards, the walls, the shops, all of this has been destroyed. After 1857, the Machi Bhavan was almost completely destroyed. So what happens with the destruction is that we don't have a sense of the organic wholeness of a place. So we don't know the intent of a person. Did they just build this Imambara on its own? Was the mosque entirely on its own? No, we don't have that sense of what the Nawab was really trying to create with this hugely ambitious complex. This is the Asafi Mosque, so the Grand Mosque, which I was showing you, also covered in monumental stucco decoration. So to look at these decorations from a closer quarter, on the top is from the Bibi Ka Maqbara gateway, which is in Faizabad. Again, very similar sort of decorations. You will see the 5-lobed petal on the top. You can see the sinuous twirling vines and flowers, and also the fish, which many of you will know. The Mahi Maratab was an important military honor given to the Nawabs, and they used the symbol of the house of fish extensively on all their buildings. Now, this sort of new aesthetic that came up, this very buoyant and vivacious sort of decoration and decorative element, wasn't confined just to the buildings. It started to be seen really in everything in Lucknow and Faizabad, including the artwork and the paintings. So this is a set of very fascinating albums called the Polier albums. Now, Antoine Polier was another European who found himself at the court of Lucknow, and he commissioned a great deal of paintings, including by the famous Meher Chand, this Indian painter who has now come to prominence to some extent. And what is amazing about the Polier albums is if you will look at simply the margins. So on the right are examples of independent margins from other albums or from the Polier collection, and you will see that each one is different. Each one uses a different variety of flower, each one uses a different style, different colors, and this is true of all the albums, every folio in those albums, and there are 12 of them. I was lucky enough to go to Berlin, which is where they are housed, and I was just going through all of them, only looking at the margin pages because they're so beautiful. So what he would have had, Polier was an independent artist just to make the border images, and then he would have fitted the final images into those borders. But this gives us an idea of just how creative art was at this time. Okay, just a quick comparison here with an image that is also in the DHA collection. It is of an area from the Taj Mahal, and it shows you in contrast how different this is. This was always considered the height of Mughal art, something that everyone should aspire to. All the artists and courts should aspire to this sort of style. And it is beautiful, of course, but I find it much more self-contained, much more austere, much more still in a way, if you compare it to the images I have been showing you till now. Okay, this is just an image to show some of the beautiful objects that were being created at this time, also in a similar luxurious manner with this efflorescence of art in the same confident manner. If you look at the woman's head ornament, right at the top, you can see two fish figures around a central flower. So very, very beautiful objects that were created in a similar style. So this is an image from 1795, which shows us that Asaf Daula was very much part of these commemorations. It was not just something that he was building, for others to use or not to take part in himself. This is an image of him during the Muharram commemoration, listening, to the stories of Muharram. And these images are really interesting to me because they show a maker of fireworks on the left. And you can see that this maker of fireworks has created an extraordinary object in the shape of a peacock. So this is a firework with a peacock as its base, because this is just a familiar bird for the local Indian artist. And he has created it like this. On the right, if you see this procession, a Hindu procession, a very similar peacock has been made to carry whatever religious structure is being carried, because once again, a peacock is familiar to whoever is making these structures. On the next one, please. And here you can see for a Muharram procession, the very same peacock there, a little bit to the left, carrying one of the taziyas. So the point I want to make in this is that there was a great deal of exchange in the language of art and crafts that was happening in Lucknow at this time. There was no demarcation that this is going to be, a Muslim commemoration or this is going to be a Hindu one. There was a lot of exchange and interplay in the art and in the architecture. Oh, it seems to have come on in only a half manner somehow. This is an image we can't really make out because the buildings are missing. The point I wanted to make was, during the Muharram at this time, what would happen on the 10th day when they carried the tazia to a water body would be that, unlike the image earlier, if you remember, where the Muharram procession is shown sort of suspended in space, what we know is actually what happened is that the procession would take place in the city, in the structures built specifically for this purpose. So perhaps if we go to the next image, if it's clearer, Okay, so this is not showing Muharram, but I just want to show you that this is how it would have looked. The procession would have gone through, say, the Rumi Darwaza, it would have gone through the courtyard, it would have gone through all the different gateways, it would have gone through the city spaces, and then gone via the Imambara and gone to the, perhaps the river or to the Karbala. Here again we have the images of the sorts of taziyas that were created, the tombs, and you can see that the ones in the middle are very clearly based on some Mughal tomb architecture. So the craftspeople have built this in that style, whereas the ones on the right look more like a Hindu temple, and the ones right in the distance are more just like a village hut. So you see the artisans and the craftspeople just sort of building whatever is familiar to them and making it part of this great procession. Here is a Shaivite night procession painted a little later, to show you that the essence is really very similar. The ones in the Muharram processions really reflect a lot of the indigenous traditions already taking place. So this is a plan of Lucknow, where I just wanted to show you very quickly that the great Imambara is up there on the left, with the Machi Bhavan would have been there. And it seems to me that Daula was edging away to the left, whereas the residency buildings were all coming up on the right. Someone like Claude Martin, for example, he was building Constantia all the way on the right edge of this area. And Daula, on the other hand, started building his Daulat Khana. After building this huge complex towards the end of his life, he was actually moving even further left. Which seems to me a way for him. I feel that he was instinctively moving away from the British influence, which was becoming ever more stronger at that time. The residency buildings were getting bigger. The EIC was becoming much more confident. But Asaf-ud-Daula was carrying on with his program, a very Lucknowi program, in this sort of hidden space to which the British officials did not have that much ingress. They didn't really know what was happening in these spaces. They were also, in the same manner, we have spoken about Muharram a great deal today, but they were also patronizing Holi. And in the next image, we see Asaf-ud-Daula enjoying Holi. And in fact, his biographers grumble a lot about Asaf-ud-Daula, that he spends so much on Holi, he spends so much on all the marriage celebrations, he spends so much on all his processions equally. So he was, equally involved in celebrating the various Hindu rituals in his city. So that brings me really just to this concluding image from the Polier album, in which I wanted to say that really through this huge program that the Nawabs were building in Lucknow, it was not just what they were doing was not simply a challenge to Mughal Sunni, to the Sunni Mughals at Delhi, because by this time really they didn't pose much of a challenge for these very vibrant provincial centers that were coming up, but rather they had got together all of their people, whether they were Hindus or Shias or Sunnis, Afghans, all sorts of people who made up a very cosmopolitan world, which we see in this painting. And they were posing a challenge to the company. They were posing a challenge to the English, whom by this time they had realized were the real threat, to the integrity of these Indian states. And I'll just, on a concluding note, just read a small para that I have taken in my book, in which I have quoted from a witness of that time. And they describe these celebrations, and they say urban and rural Hindus venerated Hussain and incorporated his cult into their rituals. They offered flowers and sweets at local Karbalas, participated in processions, decorated and kept taziyas, and sought Hussein's intercession in disease and calamity. The Imam's trials and tribulations inspired faith in a universal nemesis, ensuring justice for oppressed souls. In popular belief, he was Ram of Ayodhya, carrying his crusade into the wilderness. His brother Abbas personified Lakshman, devoted, energetic, and brave. His sister Zainab and wife Kulsum were cast in the image of Sita, caring, dutiful, and spirited. Yazid, the Umayyad ruler and Hussein's persecutor, was Ravan, greedy, corrupt, ambitious, cruel, and ruthless. I think we can leave it there, Giles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ira, for that brief introduction. The book, I have to tell you, covers many other aspects of life in Lucknow, although Ira's concentrated this evening on the building programs of Asaf and Daula particularly. There's a lot more about courtly life and the poets and the family politics, and also, of course, the relations with the British, who do not come out of this story very well, I have to say. But I wanted to start where you started, and to tie that into actually the question of financial problems, because you began with Safdarjung's tomb, and it's kind of worth reinforcing the point. Perhaps those of us who live in Delhi don't often think of this or take this for granted, that when you think of the great Mughal buildings, it's often the sepulchral architecture that comes to mind. Humayun's tomb, obviously, and Akbar's tomb, the Taj Mahal. And therefore it's worth reflecting that after, indeed I was going to say the 6 great Mughals, actually it's after just 5 of them, there are no great Mughal tombs dedicated to emperors anymore. They're all buried in small graves in dargahs. And the last great sepulchral Mughal tomb is actually that of a courtier, of Safdarjung. And of course that speaks partly to a shift in power and a shift in money, that really after 1739, after the Nadir Shah sacking of Delhi, the Mughals are, if they're lucky, on their knees. I mean, they occasionally manage to. They never really can stand upright again, and so money has shifted and power has shifted. But at the same time, Asaf Daula, as you recount in the book, is forever at loggerheads with the company on financial terms. And I wondered if you could just remind us to sketch that a little bit, and also talk about how he managed to reserve funds for these incredibly ambitious building programs. I mean, the scale of, if any of you have not been to the borough in Mumbai, then do go. Just for the scale of the thing. And it's actually a feature of the period in other up-and-coming former provinces in Hyderabad, in Murshidabad,
yeah.
And indeed in places like Jaipur. Hugely ambitious building projects.
Yeah.
And so where is the money coming from for these, given his problems with the company?
So quite simply, by not paying taxes to the Mughal center, because from 1740, everyone, bit by bit, everyone stopped sending in revenue to the Mughal center, which is what they were meant to be doing. They were supposed to be collecting revenue and sending it back to the Mughal emperor. And after Nadir Shah, and once the various elite realized that the Mughals really are crumbling and there's no power to be had in the center, they keep their resources to themselves. And Awadh is an extremely, extremely rich area. I think we just don't realize today just how rich they were. And as Giles was saying, there's a relentless pressure by the British. So they have already wrung Bengal dry. By 1772, there's an enormous famine because they have, extracted so much money from the Bengal farmers, and they have started growing opium so that there's no food to be had when there is a drought. And by 1772, things are really, really bad. And after that, they start concentrating and looking more and more at Awadh. A very interesting thing that I realized, I mean, it's been pointed out by others, of course, Maya Jasanoff, for example, in Edge of Empire, is that really everything that was happening in India in the 18th century, we forget how much they are shaped by the global wars between France and England at this time. And these are global wars on a scale which we have completely forgotten, whether it's the American Revolutionary Wars of 1775, or whether it's then, of course, the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Wars. So all of this was costing England a lot of money, and they keep looking for money to pay off these debts in their colonies, and specifically in India. So they do keep coming to Awadh and try, to get more and more money from the Nawabs. Till the end of Nawab Asaf Daula's life, he is able to resist them to a great extent. So even whatever he does pay them is a fraction of what he is earning through agricultural revenues. Awadh is pretty well run at this time. There are many accounts of how green and prosperous it is. So he manages to keep this to a minimum. This program of building the Imambara cost apparently 20 million rupees at that time. So over a 5-year period, it cost 4 million every year. And he just seems to do this quite casually, at the same time doing all sorts of other things, patronizing, all sorts of other things. So I think we've forgotten how very rich Awadh was at this time. And he is able to resist. It's really with Saadat Ali Khan, his step-brother, in 1798, that there is a revision of the terms by the British, and they start extracting a lot more money at that time.
Just tell our audience what you found out about. There's one episode of this matter of the company putting the screws on the region generally, is the so-called Chet Singh affair of 1781, where Warren Hastings sails up the river, up the Ganga, to extract more from Raja Chet Singh. I had no idea before reading your book that the Begums of Awadh were involved in this. That, I think, is something that you discovered while you were...
I did, yes.
So tell us about that, because I think that's a...
That could be an entirely different talk, Giles. In 2 minutes.
What have they got to do with it? That's the point.
So Hastings, Governor General at that time, has got money on his mind, because England has run up a huge debt during the American Revolutionary War. So their debt goes up in 5 years from 74 million to 224 million pounds. Because of the Revolutionary War that are being fought in North America. So Hastings comes to Awadh to try and raise some of that money. Chet Singh has been paying his subsidy every year, like a good Raja that he is. But Hastings decides that there should be an emergency amount claimed for this war that is happening in America. And Chet Singh says, okay, this is too much. I really can't manage yet another amount of money this year. And Hastings is so furious at this that he comes himself from Calcutta by river with only about 50 attendants, which really shows his arrogance. And he comes into Chet Singh's palace, refuses to parley with him, locks him up in his own palace. And Chet Singh's people are so appalled at this behavior against their ruler that they free him, they get him out of the palace, and they start shooting at everybody, and they start creating a ruckus. And Hastings and his men escape by the skin of their teeth. They have to leave all their belongings behind in Benares, and they really run away to Chunar. During the months that follow, because everybody is amazed that, okay, they've managed to get the Brits on the run, the Governor General no less, the Begums in neighboring Faizabad, who are very close to the Raja of Benares, start inciting all their people to rise up in rebellion against the Brits and get rid of them once and for all. And they say this. The rumors arrive that Hastings is dead, that his head is on a picket stick outside Benares. And the Begums are delighted. They're saying, come on, let's get rid of these pests once and for all. And they incite through their Khwaja Saras, through their eunuchs, because they were women in Parda, and they use the intermediary of Khwaja Saras to get their orders across. So they send out their Khwaja Saras, who go up and down the streets of Faizabad. At that time, that was the capital. And they incite all the military-looking men to join up and fight against the Brits. And for a few months, there is complete pandemonium. And Hastings writes later, or one of his men who is a manager of the lands, he writes to Hastings to say these two ladies, including the old Nawab Begum, who is the mother, they have both almost effected our ruin by making the men stand up and fight for Raja Chet Singh. So I had no idea of the extent of insurrection, and that is something that I saw throughout my book, that there are insurrections, there is resistance at every stage. We tend to think of the 18th century as inevitable British dominance, that this happened, very easily, that there was no way out. But at each stage, people resist in the most extraordinary way. People like, women in Parda, their eunuchs, the kings, people resist to a far greater extent. And I think it's something, that needs to be remembered.
Great. I'm going to open this up in a minute, but just while you all gather your thoughts, I'm just going to pitch one last thing to you on a slightly different topic and ask you to speculate on a certain matter, because I think you've made a good case for the visual style, if you like, or the courtly culture of Lucknow. Obviously, it has a a Mughal antecedent, but you've talked about the ways in which it develops and changes that, and also the greater assimilation required because of the Shia Sunni distinction, as well as assimilating Hindu festivals, as the Mughals had also done. What is it that changes in the period after your book, as it were, that these two Nawabs, they're very conscious of their Shia identity, of the Islamic heritage, but under the 19th century, obviously it goes on until 1856, under the later Nawabs, Ghaziuddin Haidar, Wajid Ali Shah, you've got a complete change of approach where it's much more an attempt to assimilate Western classical architecture. The imitation of neoclassical architecture is just a loss of vision, a change of direction. What do you think? I know it's outside the remit of your book, but just talk us through to the end, as it were.
Looking at what Asaf Daula was doing, because he's there till 1798, what I found amazing, because he also does incorporate some elements in some of his buildings. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones has written about how there are many structures which reflect some European influence. But it's interesting how those zones of influence remain on certain structures which are there for everyone's consumption, which is there where the Europeans will see them as well. In his own personal domestic space, that remains very private, and that remains very indigenous, very Indian-style palaces and living spaces that really don't succumb much to the European space. I think he is able to maintain almost a sense of secrecy about what he is doing. That was why I showed that, that image of the map, where he almost seems to be angling away from the residency and from the European influence. He is keeping this area almost away from the zone of European influence, but especially after Saadat Ali comes, the Brits will just not listen, to reason at all anymore. They are now determined, to get Awadh in their grasp, and so it is much harder after this for the Nawabs to really maintain that kind of independence in their structures. And I think, in a sense, it's pragmatism. It's saying, okay, well, this is how it's going to be, and now we are kind of forced to assimilate this sort of architecture as well. But as long as Shuja-ud-Daula and Asaf-ud-Daula were there, I think they managed to keep them at the edge of their influence.